the first time I realized they had taken all three: my name, my work, and my place at the table. I was standing in a ballroom full of people who had once shaken my hand, quoted my strategy back to me, and then nodded politely, while another woman wore my surname, and another man accepted applause for the business I built. That is not a metaphor. It is not the kind of dramatic sentence people use to sharpen a story after the fact. I mean it literally. The woman sitting in my seat had my last name on her place card. The man accepting the award was using my work as his acceptance speech. And the family at the head table had spent the last 18 months acting as if I had somehow become optional inside the very empire my hands had stabilized. If you had walked into the Winter Benefactors' dinner that night and only looked briefly, you would have thought the Hale family had always looked exactly like that. Victor Hale, at the center. Tuxedo. Silver cuff links. Calm smile. The kind of polished face investors trust because it always seems lit from the right angle. His mother, Sabrina Hale. To his right, in black silk and diamonds cold enough to count as weather. And on his left, in the seat where I used to sit, was a woman named Tessa Wynne, head of public partnerships. Chin tipped just slightly, as if she had been born for that chair. In front of her, in thick cream cardstock with gold calligraphy, were two words: Mrs. Hale. I stared at that card for 3 full seconds before my body caught up to what my eyes were seeing. Mrs. Hale. My name. My place. My chair. And no one at that table, not Victor. Not Sabrina. Not the trustees. Not the donors who had once watched me steer 3 crises in 1 quarter, while Victor played heir apparent in a navy suit, seemed remotely troubled by it. That was the genius of what they had done. They had not pushed me out all at once. They had made my absence look administrative. My separation from Victor had not even been public yet. Not formally. Not in the way rich families announce uncomfortable things once lawyers have turned pain into language neutral enough for newsletters. We were taking space. We were navigating private complexity. We were allowing for personal recalibration. That was Sabrina's preferred line. Because it preserved optionality. If I came back quietly, they could call the distance temporary. If I didn't, they could say I had stepped away from the demands of the family business. But the truth was uglier. I had not stepped away. I had been edged out. My title was diluted first. Then my access. Then my name. And now, beneath crystal chandeliers and donor light, they were testing whether the room would accept the final version. That Victor had always been the architect. Sabrina had always been the power. And I had merely been some transitional feminine presence whose purpose was to leave gracefully when replaced. The award that night was for strategic turnaround. That is what nearly made me laugh, because if there was one thing in that room that belonged to me more clearly than my own last name ever had, it was the turnaround. 4 years earlier, Hale Civic Ventures had been a collapsing prestige machine, too many flashy commitments. Not enough liquidity discipline. City contracts bleeding through vanity expansions. Donor confidence held together by old family myth and excellent tailoring. Victor still thought leadership meant being photographed near hard hats and saying words like community over site renderings he had barely read. Sabrina understood power but not systems. She believed pressure could replace design if applied by the right surname. I was the one who stopped the implosion. I rebuilt the municipal housing bid structure. I renegotiated the lender schedule during the East Market freeze. I consolidated 3 failing projects into 1 recovery portfolio and sold the board on a 90-day stabilization plan when everyone else was still speaking in euphemisms. Victor called it our turnaround in public. Then the Hale recovery model. Then, eventually, just what my family built. That is how theft works in legacy rooms. Not with one giant lie. With repeated reduction, until everyone gets bored enough to let the truth die quietly. I was still looking at the place card when Owen Mercer found me. Owen had been the company's outside restructuring counsel during the worst of the recovery years. Dry voice. Sharp eyes. The kind of man who never wastes sympathy on people who still have usable options. He stopped beside me near the back of the ballroom and followed my gaze to the head table. Then he said, very quietly, "They moved fast." I did not answer right away. On stage, Victor was being introduced by a trustee who was currently praising his family-led strategic vision. Tessa folded her hands in my seat and smiled exactly where cameras prefer. Sabrina looked serene enough to be painted. Then Owen added, "They changed the archive credits too." That was the moment the night stopped being about humiliation and became about proof. Not because I was no longer angry, because anger finally had a shape. I turned to him. "When?" "This afternoon," he said. And Delaney. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Because once someone edits the archive the same day, they seat another woman under your married name at your own table. The insult is no longer emotional. It is strategic. And strategy, unfortunately for the Hale family, was always my best subject. I looked back at the head table. At the woman wearing my place. At the man rehearsing gratitude over my work. At the mother who had spent years teaching the room, whose blood mattered, and whose labor could be absorbed without acknowledgement. Then I smiled. Not because I was hurt less. Because I understood more. They thought they had already taken everything. What they had actually done was make the theft visible enough for me to take it all back in one night. The truth is, they took my name first. Not legally. Socially, that is sometimes worse. When I married Victor Hale, I didn't take his last name because I was dazzled by the family. I took it because I still believed in the old-fashioned fantasy that building with a man meant becoming part of the architecture together. I was 32. Already respected in municipal strategy circles. Already sharper than most of the men in rooms that called themselves visionary. And still foolish enough to think love could survive proximity to dynasty if I worked hard enough to keep dignity at the center of it. Sabrina Hale disabused me of that almost immediately. Not openly. She was too trained for crude hostility. Sabrina never attacked directly when a slower poison would do. She welcomed me with pearls. Air kiss. And language so polished you could cut your hand on it without noticing until later. At brunches, she would introduce me as Victor's brilliant wife, Delaney. Never by title. Never by discipline. Never by the fact that I had already stabilized one city-backed housing portfolio before Victor had finished confusing leadership with inheritance. If a donor asked what I did, Sabrina would smile and say, "Delaney has such a practical mind. She's wonderfully grounding for Victor." Grounding. That word followed me for years. Not strategist. Not operator. Not architect. Grounding. As if I were a weighted blanket for male ambition. Victor let it happen. That should have told me everything. A husband does not have to shout to participate in your reduction. Sometimes all he has to do is fail to interrupt the first version of you that makes him look larger. The Hale family business, Hale Civic Ventures, was already wobbling when I entered it properly. Too many prestige developments. Not enough cash discipline. Too much family mythology. Not enough actual systems. Sabrina believed proximity to old money could carry a project through structural weakness. Victor believed charisma could carry everything else. He had the face, the voice, the right schools, the right handshake, and the inherited confidence of a man who had never once in his life been mistaken for support staff. I had the work. That was the real imbalance between us from the beginning. Not emotion. Competence. The first 6 months of our marriage were still private enough that Victor admitted it. Late at night. In the study. Jacket off. Tie loosened. He would sit across from me while I rebuilt a municipal reporting model he had promised investors was already streamlined. And he would say things like, "I don't know how you see this stuff so fast." Even then, some part of him knew the business started making sense in my hands. The crisis that truly changed everything came the following year when East Market stalled. That project should have sunk us. Financing delays. Public pushback. Cost overruns hidden under optimism for so long they had started breeding interest. The board was fractured. The lenders were circling. And Victor kept trying to host steak dinners, as if appetite were a substitute for restructuring. I built the recovery plan in 9 days. 9. I renegotiated milestone triggers. Folded the vendor liabilities into a survivable sequence. Redrafted the city-facing commitments. And created the portfolio consolidation model that stopped the whole venture from bleeding out in public. Owen Mercer, our outside counsel, then, told me on day 6. You know this is the only coherent plan anyone's brought into this room. Right? I knew. Victor knew too. The first time he presented my work to the board. He still said, Delaney and I have been up all week on this. That was the beginning of the theft. Because once the plan worked, once the lenders calmed, once the city stopped using the word concern, once donors started calling it a masterful turnaround instead of a family embarrassment, the language began to change. My authorship became partnership. Partnership became support. Support became atmosphere. It happened one board dinner at a time. One donor introduction at a time. One softened anecdote after another, until the room no longer thought of me as the person who built the spine. Only the woman who stood closest to the man wearing it. Sabrina accelerated the process once she understood the danger clearly. The danger was not that I was competent. Competent women can be used. The danger was that other people were starting to notice where the competence actually lived. After East Market, trustees started asking for me by name before meetings. Lenders CC'd me directly. City officials waited for my read before accepting Victor's assurances. And that was intolerable to Sabrina, because bloodline families can survive scandal more easily than visible dependence on an outsider, especially a daughter-in-law whose mind starts looking easier to trust than the heirs. So she began adjusting the room. My formal title stalled in committee while Victor's expanded. My quotes disappeared from external materials. My memos were increasingly routed through his office before distribution. At dinner tables, Sabrina would say things like, Delaney is invaluable in helping Victor refine the larger vision. Every word designed to move me one seat farther from origin. Even my surname changed shape in her mouth. Publicly, I became Mrs. Hale more often than Delaney. That sounds small if you haven't lived inside it. But there is a particular kind of erasure that happens when your married name becomes the only acceptable frame for your identity, while your actual labor is being absorbed upward into the family that gave you the name in the first place. They did not just want me attached to the Hale brand. They wanted my independent self dissolved inside it. By the 3rd year, people were quoting my work back to me as Victor's instinct. That is a strange kind of violence, to sit in a room and hear your own thinking wearing your husband's voice. But I let too much of it pass. Why? Because the work mattered. Because hundreds of units and city contracts and public commitments sat on top of systems I had built. And I told myself I could survive the social diminishment if the actual outcomes held. Because every time I confronted Victor privately, he'd say some version of the same thing. You know what's true between us? No. That line is a trap. A woman can lose her whole life staying loyal to truths that only exist in private while public record is being altered in real time. By the time of the benefactor's dinner, they had already trained the room to accept 3 things. Victor as architect, Sabrina as legacy, and me as marital accessory with useful instincts. That was the setup. That was how they took my name without touching the marriage certificate. They turned Mrs. Hale into a title that served them, not me. And once they were certain the room had learned that lesson, they moved on to taking my work and my seat too. The humiliation did not begin when I saw Tessa win in my chair. That was only the photograph. The real insult came 4 minutes later. When Victor used my work to win an award and then let his mother erase me out loud in front of a room full of people who knew exactly where that work had come from. The master of ceremonies was still delivering his smooth little hymn to civic leadership when Victor took the stage. Applause rose easily for him, the way it always does for men who inherit the right suit, the right jawline, the right last name. and just enough female labor behind them to look original under warm lighting. He smiled. He adjusted the microphone. He paused just long enough to let the room settle into him. Then he began speaking in my language. Not roughly. Not almost. Mine. The East Market recovery phrasing. The lender sequencing principle. The line about stabilizing confidence before scaling commitments. The framing I had written after 3 nights without real sleep when Hale Civic Ventures was one bad quarter away from public embarrassment, and Victor still thought a confidence dinner could fix a structural cash problem. He delivered it beautifully. That was the worst part. If he had mangled it, some piece of me could have hidden inside contempt, but Victor was excellent at wearing borrowed architecture. He made my thinking sound native in his mouth. The room nodded. 2 trustees leaned toward each other with impressed little smiles. A donor at table 6 actually murmured, "That's why he's different." No, that's why I was dangerous. Because the things making him sound different had lived in my head first. I stood at the back of the ballroom with Owen Mercer beside me and felt the full weight of what they had done settle into place. They had not merely pushed me to the edge. They had staged the night so the room would watch my erasure and call it leadership. Victor went on. He thanked the board. He thanked the city. He thanked the Hale family tradition of standing firm when lesser institutions lose nerve. The room loved that. Of course it did. Rich people adore sentences that make inheritance sound like character. Then he said, "I was taught early that real leadership means knowing who carries the vision and who simply supports it." There it was. The line that split the evening open. The room gave that soft, appreciative laugh. Polished audiences give when they think they are hearing wisdom instead of hierarchy. I looked toward the head table. Sabrina Hale was smiling into her champagne glass. Tessa Wynne was sitting in my place beneath the card that said Mrs. Hale, as if she had been born to warm my absence. And Victor, my husband, still wearing the surname that had become a public weapon against me, stood center stage, using my strategic language to tell a ballroom full of donors that some people carry the vision and some people simply support it. A wife word. A female labor word. A beautifully upholstered word people use when they want the benefit of a woman's competence without granting her authorship. I should tell you I spoke then. I didn't, because one of the first things Sabrina Hale had ever taught me without meaning to, which makes it even uglier, was that legacy rooms are always waiting for the woman to react one level too visibly. Once she does, the room stops asking whether she was wronged and starts asking whether she was graceful enough about it. So I stayed still. And then Sabrina made it unforgivable. The MC invited her to join Victor on stage for the presentation photo. She moved toward him in black silk and diamonds, smiling like the family crest had just become flesh. The photographer arranged them beneath the company seal. Mother and son. Legacy and heir. Bloodline and continuity. Tessa in my chair below them. Me at the back of the room like a scheduling error nobody had corrected yet. Sabrina accepted the microphone without being asked. Of course she did. "Thank you," she said. Voice low and elegant and sharpened underneath. "This company has survived because the Hales always understood one thing: names matter when they're earned. And places at the table matter when they're upheld with loyalty." The room went very quiet. Because now even the slower people understood there was a target inside the sentence. Then she turned, smiling, and looked directly at Tessa. And said, "We're grateful for the women who know how to honor a family legacy instead of competing with it." The room applauded. Applauded. For my public replacement. For my reduction. For the polished announcement that I had not merely been edged out of authorship, I had been reframed as disloyal to the very structure I had held together. That was the moment the humiliation stopped being emotional and became strategic. Because nothing in that sequence was spontaneous. Not the place card. Not the archive edits Owen had warned me about. Not Victor's speech, built from my language. Not Sabrina's lines about names. Loyalty. Support. And family legacy. They had choreographed the whole thing so the room would absorb one message without ever hearing it stated plainly. Delaney Ross Hale is no longer the woman who belongs in this story. And once I understood that, something in me went cold in the most useful possible way. I was no longer standing in the ballroom as a wife being hurt. I was standing there as a witness to a rollout. And rollout means record. I did not walk to the stage. That was the first thing I denied them. Because that was exactly what Sabrina wanted now. Not truth. Not correction. A visib fracture. A wife rising in a ballroom with hurt on her face. Voice shaking just enough for the room to stop asking what had been done to her and start admiring how calmly the Hales handled difficult women. No. I had spent too many years in Sabrina Hale's orbit not to understand the mechanics of genteel violence. She believed any woman could be defeated if you could make her seem emotionally unsound before the right witnesses. First you diminish her. Then you provoke her. Then you call her reaction-proof. So I stayed still. Not frozen. Not broken. Measured. Victor was still on stage beside his mother. Award in hand. Smiling, the tight donor smile of a man who thought the room had already chosen him. Tessa sat in my place beneath my surname. One hand resting lightly against the stem of her wineglass. Trying to look composed enough to pass for legitimacy. Around them, the ballroom glowed with old money and uncurated benevolence, crystal sconces, white florals, polished wood, portraits of dead benefactors who had likely spent lifetimes turning appetite into endowments. And beneath all of it, I felt my anger cool into shape. That is the moment most people misunderstand when they hear stories like this later. They imagine rage like fire wild. Immediate. Cleansing. But the most useful rage I have ever known was cold. Precise. It removed noise. It told me exactly what mattered and what did not. What did not matter was whether Victor still loved me in some stunted, self-serving way. What did not matter was whether Sabrina believed her own mythology. What did not matter was whether the room had fully realized yet that they were watching a public replacement ceremony disguised as a leadership dinner. What mattered was record. I turned to Owen Mercer. He was still facing the stage. Jaw set. Eyes narrowed in that dry lawyer way that meant his moral judgment had already finished and his procedural brain was catching up. When did they edit the archive? I asked. This afternoon, he said. And the seating? He glanced toward the head table. Last-minute revision. I only saw the final chart 20 minutes ago. Of course. Fast enough to prevent challenge. Slow enough to look logistical. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't clumsy cruelty. It was rollout. Tessa in my chair. My surname on her place card. My strategic language in Victor's speech. Sabrina's little sermon about loyalty and earning names. Every piece designed to create a new visual memory before anyone had time to object. I asked Owen one more question. Do you still have access to the internal archive server? That got his attention. He looked at me fully then. Not with pity. Thank God. I cannot bear pity from competent men. It always feels like a delay tactic disguised as care. With cause, he said. I nodded toward the stage. There's your cause. He followed my gaze. Victor was back at the podium now, laughing softly at something the MC had said. The award angled just so for the room. Sabrina sat with the kind of satisfaction women like her mistake for innocence. Tessa kept her chin level. But I could already see the slightest tightness in her shoulders. Good. Some part of her knew this arrangement had not been earned cleanly. Owen exhaled once through his nose. Then he said, Come with me. That was my retreat. Not to the parking lot. Not to a restroom stall to cry where marble and good lighting could make my grief look elegant. To the back corridors. To the actual architecture. We moved through the side hall behind the ballroom. Past stacked banquet chairs. Service carts. Extra linens. The quiet machinery of events rich people pretend happen naturally. I have always trusted the back of a building more than the front. The front is where narrative lives. The back is where labor hides with its sleeves rolled up. Owen used his credentials to get us into the executive prep room beside the media office. Small, Neutral. One long table. Two monitors. A coffee machine no one had cleaned properly. And a locked cabinet full of branded materials. The room smelled like printer toner and stale caffeine. Perfect. The kind of room where truth still had decent Wi-Fi. He opened the archive server. I stood beside him while the file tree loaded. And there it was. The gala presentation folder. The seating revision log. The donor packet. The legacy timeline media kit. Each one with timestamps. Edit trails. Approvals. My heart didn't pound. It settled. That's how I knew I was no longer in the part of pain that begs. I was in the part that builds. The first file we opened was the timeline deck. Earlier versions named me in strategic development during the East Market recovery and municipal expansion phase. Later versions reduced me to advisory mention. The final public deck removed me completely. The second file was worse. The seating chart revision log. Original. Mrs. Delaney Hale. Seat 3. Revised. Ms. Tessa Wynne Head Table. Seat 3. Revised place card label. Mrs. Hale. I stared at that line long enough for Owen to go quiet beside me. There it was in clean black text. Not implication. Not interpretation. A deliberate substitution of woman and title. They had not just seated her in my place. They had relabeled her with my public identity. I should have cried then. I didn't, because now we had proof of the thing. Rich families always rely on no one being able to prove cleanly that humiliation was not accidental. And replacement was not symbolic. It had been typed, saved, approved, and sent to print. My phone buzzed. Victor. Where did you go? Don't do anything rash. Rash. I almost smiled. It is always amazing how quickly men discover the language of female instability once evidence begins moving against them. I typed back, taking a minute. Be right back. That bought me time. More importantly, it gave him confidence. Men like Victor get careless when they think you are still inside the emotional script they wrote for you. Owen opened the speech draft folder next. There were 3 versions. The earliest used his normal, bland donor language. The second included my East Market recovery framework nearly verbatim. The final version tightened the language and added Sabrina's preferred themes: legacy, loyalty, family values, names earned through stewardship, not spontaneous, not rhetorical drift, coordination. I looked at the screen, then at Owen. They built this together. He gave a slight nod. Yes. That single syllable mattered more than comfort would have. Because once another competent adult names the structure with you, the gaslighting loses oxygen. I pulled my shoulders back, looked once at my reflection in the dark monitor glass, and understood the only thing that mattered now. They thought silence meant surrender. They had no idea silence was where I assembled my case. The first layer of truth was my work. Not my feelings. Not my marriage. Work. Clean. Time-stamped. Bankable work. That is what people like the Hales never fear enough. Because they mistake narrative control for permanent ownership. They think if the room has been trained properly, if the donors smile, if the board nods, if the right woman is seated beneath the right surname, then authorship becomes whatever the family says it is. But files remember. Budgets remember. Revision histories are gloriously indifferent to bloodline. Standing beside Owen Mercer in that prep room, I watched the whole structure of their theft come into view, one layer at a time. The first file we opened was the East Market Recovery Archive. And there it was. East Market Stabilization Framework. Originating draft. Delaney Ross. Revised internal strategy memo forwarded by Victor Hale. Final board circulation. Originating draft. My name. Not as wife. Not as support. Not as the grounding feminine presence Sabrina always preferred when donors were nearby. Originating draft. I leaned forward and opened the next file. Then the next. Then the next. Same pattern. The municipal confidence bridge language mine. The lender sequencing matrix mine. The portfolio triage memo that stopped the Harbor South bleed from contaminating 3 other projects mine. Even the phrase Victor had just used on stage about holding confidence steady before scale, lifted almost intact from a note I had written in the margin of a restructuring deck 3 years earlier. He had not been inspired. He had been copying. Owen said nothing for a while. Then, in that dry voice of his, he said, "He's not just using your work. He's standing on your architecture and calling it inheritance." Exactly. That was the second layer. Not ordinary credit theft. Conversion. My work had not merely been taken and renamed under Victor. It had been absorbed upward into Hale mythology until the room no longer thought a woman could have been the source in the first place. That was why Sabrina's line on stage had been so vicious. Names matter when they're earned. She wasn't just insulting me. She was defending the conversion system. The family's right to metabolize labor into legacy. I asked Owen to open the title history next. That one hit harder than I expected. Because title changes sound so administrative when they happen in real time. So survivable. One small revision in a board packet. One softened line on a directory page. One little shift in how introductions are handled. You tell yourself not to overreact. You tell yourself the real power is in the work anyway. You tell yourself mature women don't cling to titles when there are outcomes at stake. That is how they train you to swallow the theft. The archive told a cleaner story. Original title: Strategic Development Lead. Then, Executive Strategy Liaison. Then, Family Office Integration. Then, nothing on the public leadership page at all. I stared at the sequence until my face went hot. Because that was how they had taken my work out of the room before taking my seat out of the room. First, they made me harder to name professionally. Then they made me easier to reframe relationally. By the time they seated Tessa beneath Mrs. Halley, the public version of me had already been softened almost to vapor. You cannot defend what the room has been trained not to see. Unless you have the records. Owen opened the board notes around the second title change. Sabrina's fingerprints were everywhere. Not directly. Never directly. She was too elegant for that. But the language in the margins sounded exactly like her. Unify external-facing leadership identities. Reduce confusion around family and executive roles. Consolidate brand trust under stable public heads. The third layer of truth was my money, during the East Market freeze. When the lenders delayed and Sabrina insisted the family must never look frightened publicly. I had moved personal liquidity fast to prevent the public default cascade. Not because I wanted heroics. Because if the company slipped then, half the housing commitments tied to the municipal package would have collapsed with it. Victor had called me from the office that night and said, "You saved us." 3 months later. At a donor dinner. He called it a flexible family bridge period. I had let that pass. The archive did not. There in the internal financial memo was the transfer trail. The contingency coverage. The note that the emergency bridge had originated from me. And the later revision where the language had been changed for external use. Changed by whom? Victor's office. Approved by whom? Sabrina Hale. I actually laughed then. Once. Quietly. Not because it was funny. Because it was finished. The pattern was no longer arguable. Name diluted. Title downgraded. Work absorbed. Money sentimentalized. Seat reassigned. Archive edited. Public replacement installed? This was not a family conflict. It was a hostile narrative takeover. My phone buzzed again. Victor. Where are you? Mom says you're making this bigger than it is. I showed the screen to Owen. He gave me one long look and said, "That text alone tells me he still thinks this is emotional. He thinks I'm upset." I said, "You are upset." "Yes," I said, "but that's not what's going to ruin him." That was the fourth layer of truth. My value had never depended on being Mrs. Hale, or on Victor admitting what I built, or on Sabrina granting me legitimacy in the right room. My value was in the fact that the institution they were trying to wear as bloodline had passed through my mind. My models. My signatures. And even my personal capital, in ways they could no longer scrub cleanly enough to survive public correction. They had spent years convincing the room I was ornamental. The archive said I was structural. And once a woman realizes the room has mistaken her for decorative while she is actually load-bearing, she becomes very difficult to remove politely. I looked back toward the ballroom doors. Music. Muffled now. Applause. Maybe. Or just silverware. The room was still out there. Still glowing under chandeliers. Still swallowing the version of the night the Hales had prepared for it. Not for much longer. When I walked back into the ballroom, Victor still thought he was in control. That was the first sign he was going to lose. Because men like my husband only look powerful while they still believe the woman they underestimated is operating inside the emotional script they wrote for her. In Victor's version of the evening, I was hurt. Maybe furious. Maybe humiliated enough to leave. But still fundamentally reactive. Still orbiting him. Still, someone whose pain could be managed with a hallway conversation. A lowered voice. And the old tired language of not here. Not tonight. Don't make this bigger than it is. He had no idea I was past pain. I was in pattern now. That is a much more dangerous place to meet a woman you have been quietly dismantling. The ballroom had shifted while I was gone. Not visibly. Not to anyone untrained. The quartet was still playing. Waiters still moved with silver trays and stiff wrists. Donors still stood beneath the chandeliers pretending charity and wealth had always loved each other naturally. But the air had changed. A room can feel when something is wrong long before it admits it aloud. Victor was off stage now. Award in hand. Making the rounds with that same polished smile. Tessa was still at the head table in my chair beneath my name. But she no longer looked comfortable. Good. Sabrina saw me the moment I crossed back in. Of course she did. She drifted toward me from the donor cluster with a face composed into maternal concern so flawless it would have fooled anyone who hadn't lived beneath it. Black silk. Diamond earrings. One hand lightly touching the wrist of a city commissioner as she excused herself. As if every room owed her continuity. Delaney, she said softly when she reached me. There you are. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just possession in a lowered voice. I looked at her and smiled the way women do when they have finally stopped asking permission to understand what is happening to them. Sabrina, she glanced past me. Probably checking whether I had returned alone. Whether I looked tearful enough to be manageable. Whether Owen was still near enough to matter. He was at the west wall now. Speaking to the event director with his phone in hand and that dry, forensic expression that meant his respect for the evening had expired. Victor is worried about you, she said. That almost made me laugh. Not worried about what he had done. Not worried about the seating chart. Not worried about my name on another woman's card. Worried about me. As if I were the instability in the room. I said, "That's generous of him." Her eyes sharpened. Sabrina had always hated irony in other women. She considered it vulgar, unless she was the one using it. "Let's not turn a private misunderstanding into a public mess," she said. There. That word. Private. A word people like Sabrina only discover after they have finished humiliating you in public. I asked. Which part was the misunderstanding? My name on another woman's place card? Or my work in Victor's acceptance speech? She held my gaze for 1 second too long. Which was answer enough. Then she did what women like her always do when they sense narrative slippage. She reached for my arm. Not roughly. Worse. Intimately. Like she still had the right. Delaney? Families go through transitions, she said. Strong women know when grace matters more than recognition. There was the whole creed. Grace over recognition. Silence over authorship. Composure over truth. Everything she had been teaching me since I married her son. Packed into one poisonous little sentence and delivered like wisdom. I did not pull away. That unsettled her. Because withdrawal she could use. Tears she could manage. But stillness? Stillness meant I was no longer fighting for dignity inside her rules. Behind her, Victor started moving toward us. He had seen enough of our posture to understand this was no longer recoverable with distance. The award was gone from his hand, now someone had taken it. Or he'd set it down. Good. Let the symbol wander while the substance collapsed. He arrived wearing that soft emergency face men use when they need everyone to think they are calming a woman rather than containing evidence. Can we talk somewhere else? I looked at him. Why? He lowered his voice. Because you're upset. No, I said. I'm informed. That landed harder than I expected. I saw it in his face immediately. Not guilt. Victor's ego was too padded for immediate guilt. Fear. The first small, clean fear of a man realizing the woman in front of him is no longer operating from injury alone. He glanced at Sabrina. That also mattered. Because Tessa saw it. She was watching from the head table now, pretending to smooth her napkin while staring directly at the little triangle of us near the center aisle. And in Victor's reflexive look toward his mother, the whole structure revealed itself. Not husband managing a misunderstanding. Not executive guiding a difficult evening. Son awaiting instruction. Tessa noticed. 2 trustees noticed. And one of the donors from the old East Market lender group noticed too, I knew, because his brows lifted almost imperceptibly before he turned back to his wife and murmured something into her ear. Rooms do not need full truths to begin withdrawing respect. They only need enough contradiction to smell performance. Victor tried again. Delaney. We can sort all this out tomorrow. Tomorrow. There it was again. Delay is control. I said. You already sorted it out this afternoon. He went still. Only for a second. But I saw it. Sabrina saw that I saw it. Now we were all looking at the same thing. The fact that he knew the edits were fresh. The place card was fresh. The archive changes were fresh. The replacement wasn't symbolic. It was scheduled. His voice got quieter. What exactly do you think you know? That question told me more than any confession could have. Because innocent men ask what you're talking about. Guilty men ask how much you know. I smiled. Enough. That was when the panic really entered both of them. Not theatrically. No gasps. No shouting. These were wealthy people trained from birth to keep collapse inside the ribcage. But I watched it travel through them anyway. Victor's jaw tightening. Sabrina's shoulders pulling a fraction too straight. Her thumb pressing once against her own palm the way she did whenever a room stopped obeying. And the room was stopping. Conversations nearby had thinned. Tessa was no longer pretending not to watch. Owen was walking back toward us now. Unhurried. Which is exactly how dangerous men move when procedure is about to replace politeness. Victor said. Don't do anything reckless. I could have thanked him for that line. Because once a man calls truth reckless, half the work of exposing him is already done. I said. Reckless was putting another woman under my name before checking whether I still had the records. For the first time all night. Victor lost his face completely. And Sabrina, elegant. Untouchable. Legacy drunk Sabrina Hale looked at me, not like a daughter-in-law anymore. Not like a nuisance. Not like an emotional wife to be contained. She looked at me like a structural problem. Exactly. Now she finally understood what I was. The reveal began with a seating chart. Not a scream. Not a glass thrown across the ballroom. No, the reveal began the way all truly devastating reversals should begin in a room like that. With documents. Owen Mercer did not raise his voice. He stepped beside me near the center aisle, held his phone low, and said, The event director needs to see this now. That was all. No theatrical urgency. No panic. Just procedure. Which made it deadly. Because once the room stops framing your pain as emotional and starts routing it through institutional process, People like Victor and Sabrina lose the one thing they rely on most: the ability to call reality a misunderstanding. The event director, a narrow-faced woman named Claire Doss, with headset wires tucked behind one ear, and the permanent expression of someone who had spent 20 years keeping rich people from ruining their own events, came over expecting a donor complaint. Owen showed her the seating chart revision log first. Her eyes moved once across the screen. Then again. Then she looked up, not at me, but at Tessa Wynne seated under the place card that read, Mrs. Hale, and something in her face hardened into professional horror. "Is this real?" she asked. I said. "It came from your final print file." Claire swallowed. That alone would have been enough to shake the evening. Another woman in my seat under my name. Publicly. At a head table, during an unresolved separation not yet announced to the board or donor class. But Owen wasn't finished. He showed her the archive revision history next. The leadership timeline. Earlier version. My name attached to the East Market Stabilization and Civic Portfolio Restructure. Later version. Softened. Final gala version. Removed entirely. Then, the speech draft sequence. My strategy language in Victor's final remarks. Sabrina's edit notes in the margin. Little elegant phrases about legacy, loyalty, family continuity. Proof that what sounded spontaneous on stage had actually been curated. My work lifted. My role downgraded. My absence staged. Claire's face changed again. Not sympathy. Liability. Good. Because in rooms like that, sympathy gets whispered over later drinks. Liability acts immediately. "I need to speak with the board chair," she said. "You do," Owen replied, "before this becomes discoverable in front of more cameras than you can control." That did it. She moved fast after that. Across the ballroom. Victor was working the room again. Hand on a donor's shoulder. Smile restored. As if panic could be massaged back into optics by touching expensive men in the correct places. Sabrina was at table 2 near the city delegation. Every inch the composed matriarch. One gloved hand resting lightly against her champagne stem, while she nodded through someone else's praise of family leadership. Neither of them yet understood the axis of power had shifted. Claire reached Elias Hargrove, the board chair. Not old. Not flashy. But wealthy, in the sterile, dangerous way of men who prefer written proof to personality. He listened for 30 seconds. Took the phone from her hand. Read in silence. Then looked directly across the room at me. Not past me. At me. That mattered. I held his gaze. Then he turned and said something to the AV technician. The technician froze. Looked at the stage screen. Looked back at Elias. Then nodded. That was when Victor finally noticed something was wrong. He broke off mid-conversation with the donor and looked toward the AV booth. His face didn't collapse, not yet, but the smile lost oxygen. Sabrina saw him change and followed his line of sight. Her posture went half an inch tighter. The ballroom music softened as the event moved toward the scheduled tribute reel. That was the slot Sabrina had designed for Hale mythology. Family photos. Project timelines. Donor-facing history. A polished inheritance sermon set to strings and grayscale drone shots. Instead, when the screen lit, the first thing that appeared was not the Hale crest. It was the file header. Event seating revision log. Winter benefactors dinner. The room went quiet in layers. Not instantly. First, the people closest to the screen. Then the tables nearest the stage. Then the donors at the back who realized the silence in front of them was not decorative and turned to look. The first highlighted line appeared. Seat 3. Head table. Original. Mrs. Delaney Hale. Revised. Mrs. Tessa Wynne. Printed card. Mrs. Hale. A ripple moved through the room. Not sound. Exactly. Recognition. Victor started toward the stage. Too late. The next slide came up before he got there. Leadership Archive, Revision History. East Market Stabilization. Delaney Ross. Municipal Confidence Bridge. Delaney Ross. Portfolio Recovery Framework. Delaney Ross. Removed from current gala presentation. Now the sound came. Not shouting. Worse? People talking at once in rich room voices, sharp whispers. Chair legs moving. One trustee saying, "What?" aloud. A donor wife leaning hard toward her husband. Tessa turning visibly pale at the head table, as if she had suddenly realized wearing another woman's name in public might not end well for her career. Victor reached the foot of the stage and hissed something at the technician. Elias stepped in front of him. Just enough. And that was beautiful, because in one tiny movement, the room saw it clearly. The board chair blocking Victor Hale from stopping the screen. Sabrina stood then. Not in panic. In authority. Which was exactly the wrong instinct. She moved toward the podium. Smile fixed so tightly it had become a mask. And said into the microphone, "I'm sure there's been some unfortunate technical confusion." The next slide cut her off. Speech draft comparison. Victor Hale, final acceptance remarks. Core language sourced from restructuring memoranda authored by Delaney Ross. There it was. My work. My name. His theft. All in one frame. Now nobody was whispering. Now the room was looking. At Victor. At Sabrina. At me. I stepped forward then. Not rushing. Not trembling. Not asking anyone to let me speak. The room parted because it already had. Because once proof enters a ballroom, hierarchy loses some of its grip. I stopped near the center aisle where everyone could see me. The woman they had watched being written out in real time. The woman whose seat had been reassigned, whose name had been printed on another woman's card, whose work had been fed back to the room through a husband polished enough to mistake theft for inheritance. Victor looked at me and said, low and furious, "What have you done?" I looked back at him. Then at Sabrina. Then at the giant screen above them both, and I answered in the only voice that mattered now, calm enough to survive the room. Clear enough to split it open. "I put my name back where you deleted it." Victor's collapse began with his voice. Not with the screen. Not with the board chair stepping in front of him. It began when he tried to speak and sounded smaller than the lie he had been standing on. "What Delaney is doing," he said, turning toward the room with one palm lifted. That old practiced gesture he used whenever he wanted to make a room, believe he was the adult and someone else was the disruption, is taking internal draft material completely out of context. Out of context. There it was. The favorite refuge of elegant thieves. Because once proof appears, people like Victor and Sabrina always rush to context. Context is where accountability goes to die in wealthy families. Context means, yes, the documents are real, but maybe reality will spare us consequences if we narrate it gently enough. Only the room was not buying it anymore. That was the important part. The room had turned. You could feel it in the silence. Not social silence. Not attentive silence. Assessment. The kind donors. Lawyers. Trustees. And city officials get very quiet inside when they realize a problem is no longer theatrical. It is reputational. Procedural. Expensive. Sabrina reached the podium and tried to reclaim the atmosphere. Of course she did. She placed one manicured hand on the mic stand and said, with almost supernatural poise, "I think everyone here understands that complex family businesses often require flexible language around contributions and leadership visibility." Flexible language. I actually smiled. Because there, in one sentence, she managed to convert theft into branding, erasure into etiquette, and my public replacement into a mere lexical inconvenience. But Sabrina had waited too long. The screen behind her still showed the seating chart. Still showed my name removed. Still showed Tessa assigned my seat. Still showed Mrs. Hale printed under another woman as if I had died between cocktails and the main course. No one was looking at Sabrina anymore. They were looking at the evidence. Tessa was the first one to break physically. She stood too quickly from the head table, chair scraping hard against the floor. Every head near her turned. She looked down at the place card, then toward Sabrina, then toward me. And in that one jagged little movement, she ceased to be a polished public partnerships executive and became what she actually was in the room. A witness caught inside someone else's fraud. I didn't know it was printed like that, she said. Too loud. Too fast. Perfect. Victor turned toward her with naked fury. Which was also perfect, because now the room could see he was not managing a misunderstanding. He was losing control of accomplices. Sabrina's face changed. Not much. A fraction. But I had lived around her long enough to read it. Immediate and blistering. Not for me. For Tessa, because women like Sabrina only tolerate useful replacements as long as they remain silent enough to function decoratively. The board chair, Elias Hargrove, stepped fully onto the stage then. No tuxedo flourish. No donor smile. Just a thin man with a grave face and the kind of stillness that signals bad news for families who think lineage outranks process. He took the microphone from Sabrina. She did not let go right away. That little struggle brief. Eyes silent. But visible did more damage to her than anything I could have said. Because it showed the room something she had spent decades preventing, that her authority had limits when confronted with institutional power she did not personally own. Elias said, "This event is paused pending immediate review of the materials shown." Paused. That word hit the room like a dropped tray. Not cancelled out of scandal. Paused. Pending review. It stripped the night of glamour and put it under governance. Where Victor and Sabrina were weakest. One donor near the west wall started putting on his coat. Then another. Then a cluster near table 5 stood all at once. Not rudely, but with the efficient energy of people who understood they were currently inside a legal memory and would prefer not to leave fingerprints on it. The city commissioner, who had been laughing with Sabrina 20 minutes earlier, turned to his aide and said, audibly, "Get me the project chronology tomorrow morning." That was delicious. Because collapse in these rooms does not arrive as screams. It arrives as withdrawal. Support retracting itself from the people it just finished applauding. Victor tried once more. He stepped toward Elias and said, "You're overreacting. This is a private marital dispute being weaponized in public." There it was. The final pathetic maneuver. Take institutional theft. Recast it as female bitterness. But Elias didn't even look at him when he answered. It ceased being private, he said, when a public event used altered records, misattributed strategic work, and a falsified seating designation. Falsified seating designation. Good God. That phrase nearly made me want to frame the evening. Because now the language belonged to the record, not the family. Sabrina turned toward me then. And for the first time all night she let the mask slip. It wasn't rage. Not exactly. Worse. Hatred without elegance. She looked at me the way Empire looks at a province that has finally learned where the tax books are kept. "You have embarrassed everyone in this room," she said. No. That was the beauty of it. I hadn't embarrassed the room. I had embarrassed the people who assumed the room could be used against me indefinitely. I said, "No, I ended the part where you thought I'd help you lie." That landed with the force of something long overdue. Marcy Ellison from the municipal board stood then, a woman who had nodded through too many hail speeches over the years and now looked physically ill. She said, clearly, "Did Delaney build East Market or not?" Silence. Victor looked at Sabrina. Sabrina looked at Elias. Tessa looked at the floor. No one answered. And that silence was the collapse. Because if the answer had been no, they would have said it instantly. If the answer had been unclear, they would have flooded the room with language. But when truth is simple and damning, the guilty often go mute in the exact shape of it. Then came the final blow. Owen Mercer stepped forward from the side aisle and said, loud enough for the first half of the ballroom to hear. For the record, the recovery framework, bridge sequencing, and lender stabilization language all originated in Delaney Ross's authored files. For the record, there. Done. Victor's shoulders sagged. Actually sagged. The donors saw it. The board saw it. Tessa saw it. And Sabrina, immaculate. Venomous. Legacy drunk Sabrina suddenly looked what she had feared becoming more than scandalous. Old. Not aged. Outdated. A woman whose power had depended on a room agreeing not to inspect her too closely. The room was inspecting now. And it did not like what it saw. The first thing I took back was not Victor. It was my name. That mattered more than people like Sabrina Hale could ever understand. Because marriage, especially the kind built around a family machine, can survive on illusion far longer than dignity can. A husband can keep telling himself he loves you while standing on your work. A mother-in-law can keep calling you family while sanding your identity down to something decorative and useful. A room can keep applauding a lie if the tuxedos fit and the lighting is expensive enough. But a name, your name, attached correctly to what you built, changes the shape of power the moment it is restored. The ballroom never recovered after the screen. That was the beginning of everything returning to me. Not because people suddenly became noble. Most of them simply became careful. Donors drifted toward exits. Trustees clustered into fast, low-voiced circles. The event staff stopped pretending this was a family misunderstanding and started moving like they were inside a legal record. Even the quartet fell silent in that awkward, wonderful way that told me the room's fantasy had been punctured beyond repair. Victor tried to get to me twice after Elias Hargrove froze the event. Twice he failed. First because Owen intercepted him with board council language and a face too dry to fight. Then because two municipal partners, men who had once ignored my emails until my recovery models saved their timelines, suddenly decided Victor owed them explanations before he owed his wife containment. That was satisfying in a way I had not expected. Not because I wanted him publicly hounded. Because, for the first time, his access to me was not assumed. Sabrina never came near me again that night. That mattered too. She remained near the stage under the dead light of the halted presentation. Back straight. Chin lifted. Still trying to wear dignity over collapse. But something essential in her had broken. She could not summon me with a look anymore. Could not pull me aside and reframe the room in softer language. Could not reach for my arm and call submission grace. She had lost the right to choreograph me. That was the second thing I took back. My place. Not the chair alone. The axis. For years I had been positioned in relation to the family, wife, support, grounding presence, behind-the-scenes stabilizer. The woman who made the brilliance more comfortable to stand near, even when the work passed through me. The public geometry always bent toward Victor and Sabrina. They got center. I got usefulness. But that night, after the screen, after the board froze the gala, after the seating chart and archive logs and speech draft comparisons stripped the polish off the lie, the geometry shifted. People came to me. Not as Mrs. Haley, as the source. Marjorie Sloan from the municipal board approached first. She had watched me rebuild East Market, then politely watched Victor take the language and wear it like family instinct. She stopped in front of me and said, "I should have asked harder questions sooner." I looked at her and said, "You can ask them now." That was enough. No comforting her. No smoothing her guilt into something prettier. I was done doing emotional cleanup for people who had benefited from my public diminishment. Then Elias came over, board packet in hand, and asked the only question that mattered. "For the record," he said, "what was your formal original role in the East Market and portfolio recovery structure?" For the record. There is almost nothing more beautiful than that phrase, after years of being translated downward by elegant thieves. I answered clearly. Strategic development lead first. Then de facto recovery architect across the East Market, Harbor South, and municipal confidence bridge sequence. The title was later diluted. By whom? Victor's office operationally. Sabrina directionally. He nodded once. Not dramatically. Just enough to tell me the institution had finally stopped asking me to prove my right to speak inside my own work. Then came the moment I had not expected to feel so sharply. The place card. One of the event staff, poor woman, pale with second-hand shame, brought it to me from the head table in both hands like it might still burn. Mrs. Halle. Cream cardstock. Gold calligraphy. My name weaponized into a seating prop for my replacement. I looked at it for a long second. Then asked for a pen. The woman handed me one immediately. I drew one line through Mrs. Hale and wrote, in clean block letters beneath it, Delaney Ross. That was the third thing I took back. Not just the marital title they had tried to turn into a family-owned costume. My actual self. Because the truth was, they had not only taken my married identity and handed it to another woman, they had spent years trying to erase the woman I had been before the Hales. As if my legitimacy began at the altar and should end the moment the family decided I had become inconvenient to the narrative. No. I existed before Victor. I led before Victor. I built before Victor. And I was done allowing even my own pain to be framed through his surname first. I handed the card to Elias. He read it. Then, with the driest possible expression, tucked it into the board file. Evidence. Perfect. By the time I left the ballroom, the board had suspended the award recognition, frozen public materials, pending internal review, and scheduled emergency council the next morning. Victor was no longer being treated like the triumphant face of the company. He was being handled like a liability. Sabrina was no longer the untouchable matriarch. She was a governance problem in silk. And me? For the first time in years, I was no longer standing at the edges of my own architecture waiting for someone else to acknowledge where the load-bearing walls had come from. I was standing in the center of the record. Under my own name. With my work correctly attached to me. And when I walked out of that ballroom, I did not feel abandoned. I did not feel discarded. I did not even feel vindicated yet. I felt legible. That is rarer. That is better. 3 months later, my name was back on the record. Not where Victor wanted it. Not where Sabrina could soften it. Not where donors could mistake it for marital decoration. Exactly where it belonged. Delaney Ross, originating strategist. East Market Recovery, lead architect. Municipal Confidence Bridge, portfolio recovery framework, authored by Delaney Ross. Dry lines. Clean lines. The kind I trust now, because once you have lived long enough inside a family machine, you stop craving emotional vindication from the people who used you. What you want instead is correct language in permanent places. The board moved faster than Victor expected and more ruthlessly than Sabrina could control. Owen Mercer and outside counsel pulled the archive history. Seating approvals. Speech drafts. Title revisions. Financial bridge records. And internal correspondence. The pattern was too clear to beautify, too recent to romanticize, too well documented to call a misunderstanding. My work had been reissued under Victor's office. My title had been diluted in stages until I became professionally unnameable. My emergency bridge funding had been absorbed into vague family language. My seat had been reassigned. My married name had been printed on another woman's place card. And the entire benefactor's dinner had been designed to install the new narrative before the truth could object. That last part killed them. Not because wealthy families cannot survive cruelty. They survive cruelty all the time. What they cannot survive easily is visible coordination. Once the board saw that the archive edits, the seating chart, the speech language, and Sabrina's public remarks were not isolated incidents, but pieces of the same rollout, the matter stopped being scandal and became governance failure. Victor lost his executive chair within 10 days. Not in a screaming match. Not with a security escort. That would have been easier for him. I think. Easier to frame later as betrayal. Hysteria. Factionalism. anything dramatic enough to preserve his self-image. No. He was removed by vote. By packet. By minutes. That is the cruelest kind of justice for men like Victor, not theatrical ruin, but administrative demotion. Being processed accurately, being reduced to what the documents can support without charm. Sabrina resigned 3 days after that. Her statement, naturally, was saturated with dignity, language. She spoke of protecting the company from distraction and allowing the next generation to rebuild trust around shared values. Not a word of apology. Not one clean sentence about the woman whose work she had spent years absorbing into bloodline mythology. But the resignation did not land the way she wanted. The city paper ran her statement beside a summary of the board review. No flattering headline, no matriarch in exile treatment. Just facts. Archival manipulation. Authorship misattribution. Title dilution. And improper public designation under the Hale name. Perfect. Tessa Wynne left quietly. I almost pitied her. Which is how I know I've changed. 3 months earlier, I would have spent hours trying to determine whether she had been complicit or merely convenient. Now I understood something simpler. People who sit down in stolen seats rarely matter as much as the hands that arranged the place card. As for me, the new order did not begin with revenge. It began with refusal. I did not keep the Hale name. That decision surprised almost everyone except me. Vinter called twice through lawyers asking whether I wanted to delay that discussion for the sake of continuity. Continuity. Imagine, after everything they had done, he still thought continuity was a favor he could offer. No. I had worn that name long enough to watch it become a tool against me. I was not interested in reclaiming Mrs. Hale. I was interested in ending the era in which anyone thought my legitimacy depended on it. So I took back Delaney Ross publicly, legally, and professionally, all at once, the day the updated leadership documents came through. I looked at my own name on the page and felt something far cleaner than triumph. Relief. Because the truth was, they had not only tried to erase me from the business, they had tried to make me believe I only existed there through them. Through marriage. Through family permission. Through table placement and bloodline choreography. That illusion died the night of the gala. The board offered me what I should have had years earlier: full strategic control over the Civic Recovery Division, direct reporting access, independent sign-off authority, and formal authorship restoration on all legacy recovery documents. The title on paper was longer and uglier than I would have written for myself. I accepted anyway. Not because I needed them to crown me. Because I was done leaving my work behind every time a weaker person tried to wear it. That is the new order people do not talk about enough. Not just that the villains fall. That the woman they depended on stops serving the structure that minimized her and rebuilds the structure under terms they can no longer touch. Victor saw me once after the board vote. In the lobby outside Council's office. He looked older. Not wrecked. Men like him rarely look wrecked in the cinematic sense. They just lose the invisible coating that made other people treat them as inevitable. He stood there in a navy coat, hands empty, and said, "You didn't have to destroy everything." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "I didn't destroy it. I named what it was when I stopped carrying it." That was the last true conversation we ever had. Now, when I walk into a boardroom, no one introduces me as grounding, supportive, graceful, family-minded, or indispensable behind the scenes. They introduce me correctly, and if a room ever again mistakes my quiet for dependency, I know exactly what to do with that too. They took my name, my work, and my place at the table because they thought all three only existed through their permission. They were wrong. My name existed before them. My work survived despite them. And my place at the table was never a gift. I built the table,